Welcome to All About Art. My name is Alexandra, and I'm an art historian, curator, and writer. Within this podcast, topics relating to art history, cultural policy, the art sector, as well as a large range of other art-related topics will be covered. Conducting critical discussions, having entertaining exchanges, or just enjoying some relaxing chats, All About Art is where you'll find it all. Join me in exploring and developing cultural discourse. Welcome to another episode of All About Art. In this episode, I sat down with British art historian and academic Dorothy Price. She is a professor of modern and contemporary art and critical race art history at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London, and was previously professor of history of art at the University of Bristol, as the first woman of color to be appointed to a chair in art history at a Russell Group university. In 2021, she was elected a Fellow of the British Academy. Listen on to hear me ask Dorothy about her specializations of German Modernism and post-war Black British art, and how she approaches these very different themes. We also speak about her experiences both curating and teaching, and she delves deeper into the processes of curating an exhibition at the Royal Academy of Arts, one of which recently closed, titled Entangles Pasts. We speak about what being a professor is like at a world-renowned art institute, along with her upcoming research projects, and much more. Thank you, Dot, for coming on the podcast. Before I dive in, I wanted to let you lovely listeners know that All About Art is on Patreon. So if you want some behind-the-scenes content, maybe a bit of merch, the chance to get one-on-ones with me and my guests, or you're simply wanting to support this project, I would be absolutely thrilled if you decided to sign up. You can do so through the link in the show notes. I also wanted to say thank you to those who have already signed up. Your support means the world, and it makes the further production, improvement, and growth of the podcast possible. And for that, I'm incredibly grateful. And now, on to the interview. Welcome to the podcast, Dorothy. To start us off, I would love for you to tell listeners more about your background. What did you study, and what has your career path in the arts looked like?
Thank you, Alexandra, and thank you for having me on the podcast. I studied history of art at university. I knew from about the age of 16 that I wanted to do history of art. And so I taught myself history of art A-level because it wasn't really offered, it still isn't. And the reason I got into history of art was that I was doing fine art. I was doing what was then O-levels. That shows my age. Many moons ago. I was doing O-levels, and I was doing an O-level in art, and I was really into art. And then I went to see a careers advisor at school, and I saw a poster, and I was basically sort of met with the usual story of like, well, what are you going to do with it if you train as an artist? And I also read a statistic that said only 1% of students at art school actually make a living from it. And that panicked me. I thought, oh, I know I'm going to have to make a living. And I was really into English literature as well. And so kind of art history found me, really. I used to like going to Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery to look at all the works there because I lived in Birmingham, and it was right next to what was then Birmingham Central Library, which has since moved elsewhere. And so I would kind of nip out between the library and the art gallery, and so I got really into the art. And so I knew very early on that I wanted to do art history, and I've been quite kind of focused on it ever since, really.
And then did you do your A-levels, and then you went to university, you studied art history, you did a master's as well as a PhD?
I didn't do a master's, no. In hindsight, I probably should have done. I don't know why. Maybe it was just the period in which I went to go and do my PhD, but I was very determined that I was going to do a PhD. So I didn't apply for a master's programme, and I applied for funding from what was then the British Academy, did the funding then. After that, it became the AHRC, Arts and Humanities Research Council. But I mean, during my time, it was the British Academy, and I applied for funding for a PhD, straight to PhD. And I didn't get it first time round, but then I think some tutors of mine intervened, and I did get it. So then I was all set. And that's kind of, it's still the case, isn't it, that funding is so crucial for postgraduate research.
Yeah.
And particularly in the arts and humanities, really. I certainly wouldn't be where I am today without that initial British Academy funding at all.
Yeah. And what is it called today?
It's called the Arts and Humanities Research Council today, the AHRC. The British Academy still exists. It's just that it's not responsible for the funding at PhD level anymore.
Right. That's really interesting to know, because I think, at least for me, my preconception of an academic, in German we say Werdegang, what is it in English? An academic route or path is very much bachelor's, master's, then a PhD. And so it's really interesting to hear that someone went straight into a PhD, but yeah, you had to try again. You didn't get granted the funds for the first time, like the first time around. And I think something like that is really interesting to hear, especially for listeners who are still thinking about their, university path, their future.
I was going to say, it's unusual not to have done an MA, and in hindsight, I wouldn't advise anyone to go straight to PhD. I think the MA is a really important route between undergraduate and PhD.
Yeah.
It's really that year where you can really consolidate what it is you're interested in and think more about research. And what I ended up doing during the first term of my PhD was actually just attending all the MA courses, because I could sit in and attend, and actually that led me to change my supervisor in the direction of my topic. So I do advocate doing an MA first. Very much so.
Okay. Well, I'm glad that we added that on. I think that, these things are really, really useful to talk about, because I think that hearing your experience and what you really think is important in terms of what types of education people should go and get. Sometimes I hear in the professional realm, it's like, oh, you don't need a master's degree. And I was so grateful that I did my master's. I did mine in arts administration and cultural policy at Goldsmiths. So not curating or art history, but I'm so grateful that I did that, because it really taught me so much about the arts and cultural sector that I would not have known otherwise. I would have never written a business plan for an arts organization elsewhere. That's given me the education that I need to continue with all of the different projects that I do, the jobs. So as someone who hasn't done a PhD but has done a master's, I completely agree that that was something that was really, really valuable for me personally.
Yeah, it's definitely the important next step if you want to continue a career in the arts after undergraduate.
So for my next question, I would love to ask you about Entangles Pasts, which is an exhibition that you curated at the Royal Academy of Arts here in London, which just closed at the end of April. Can you tell listeners about the process of putting an exhibition like that together? What is the experience like to curate a show at the Royal Academy?
That's a great question, Alexandra. The experience is one like nothing else. I mean, the Royal Academy, in terms of its exhibitions, it's a well-oiled machine. It's been putting on exhibitions for 250 years or more. So there's a lot of internal support, which is why they produce such high-quality exhibitions. And they respect the sort of intellectual vision of their external curators, and then they work really hard to help the external curators and the external curatorial team to fulfill that vision. So it's very much a collaborative venture. What I was really pleased about with Entangles Pasts in particular, but also making Modernism, which was the show I curated in 2022 to 23 for them in the side galleries. But what I was pleased with both of those exhibitions is that the vision that I had from the initial proposal through exhibitions committee when I had to present the ideas remained true. That vision was supported once it was accepted by the committee, and then we set to work straight away drawing up a loans list and working sort of through it and responding flexibly to refusals that we may have had and thinking about what our plan Bs were. But always, all the way through, the integrity of the vision never changed, particularly for Entangles Pasts.
Mm-hmm. And so if I understood correctly with the process, did you pitch the exhibition, or were you invited to pitch an exhibition and then you had to present it to the exhibitions committee?
So I was invited. So the Royal Academy normally invites external curators. They have an idea for a show they might want to do, and they find out who's an expert in the field, and then they invite them to see whether they want to pitch. And so you get sort of supported all the way through, and you're sort of asked, to prepare well before it goes to exhibitions committee, actually. So there's a lot of preparatory work goes into it. Now, for the Entangles Pasts exhibition, I was very much approached to do that by Axel Ruger, who's the director of the Royal Academy. Normally, these requests come from the curatorial team, but Axel was very concerned or very keen to build on the moment that had seen all cultural institutions really after 2020 begin to really interrogate their own histories in relation to the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement after the murder of George Floyd and the toppling of the Colston plinth. And some of the other contexts also included the Rijksmuseum putting on their slavery exhibition, which, because it was COVID, not as many people saw that as perhaps they could have done, which is a shame. But that was a really sort of radical moment in the museum world for the Rijksmuseum to be doing that. And I think the world was watching to see how that landed and what they were doing. And the Royal Academy had already started within their collections department working on looking at all their founding members and looking at their links, the historic links to the transatlantic slave economy, using the UCL database, the Legacies of Slavery. And so they've published that research. That research is available. And so there was already the beginnings of the work, and it kind of came off the back of the National Trust doing something similar, English Heritage doing something similar, all the kind of major institutions. And what was interesting about the Royal Academy's invitation, though, was that it also came within the kind of political context of the time, in that once Colston had been toppled from his plinth and institutions were beginning to make calls for other sculptures to go, the Culture Secretary at the time wrote a letter to all arm's-length bodies to basically tell them not to make politically motivated decisions about their art, otherwise their funding would be under threat. And so Axel and the Royal Academy, as an institution that's not an arm's length body, it has a different funding system. It's a royal patronage system, and it makes its money through the summer exhibitions, and it's an artist society, society for artists run and members. So Axel very kind of realised that the Royal Academy was in a perfect position to do that work. And I had been a founding member and inaugural director of the Centre for Black Humanities at the University of Bristol, was there during the period Colston was toppled from his plinth. And so they approached me. I was already working with them on something else. That's the origins of the exhibition.
Well, I remember when I saw, this was when the Arts Council then put out a statement saying exactly what you just stated, that if either organizations applying for funding or artists or people applying for, let's say, DYCP funding or anything like that, if they're linked to political motivation or have any sort of political affiliation, then they're more at risk of not getting the funding. And everyone just, it was an uproar. For me as well, I was like, this is the dumbest thing I have ever heard. Because what is
art if it's not political?
What is art if it, It's just crazy to me.
Absolutely.
This is something that the arts and cultural sector can really make waves with. That's what we have the power to do in this sector, whereas other sectors don't.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly that.
So, Dot, you are also a professor at the Courtauld Institute of Art, which is actually where we're sitting today. It is one of the world's most renowned universities for art history students. How long have you been teaching, and what does being a university professor involve?
Another great question, Alexandra. So I've actually been teaching pretty much my entire career, so for about 30 years, but I've only been at the Courtauld for the last 3 of those. So I joined the Courtauld in 2021. Being a university professor involves devising courses, teaching students, developing a programme of research, supervising PhD students, running an MA programme. I think particularly at the Courtauld, the most sort of prized teaching for the Courtauld as an institute is their MA programme. So there are about 45 members of staff, and we each run our own MA programme, and we recruit our own MAs onto the programme, and it's very much related to the individual faculty members' research. So it's a really great way of combining what a university professor does in terms of their own research and their teaching, and it's a way of also exploring new issues, new ideas, new questions. And as we talked about earlier about the importance of MAs in one's sort of formative development, it's a really special thing to be able to do.
And you're professor of modern and contemporary art and critical race art history. For some listeners who may still be considering options for their university degree, I'd love to ask you, what sort of themes do you focus on in your curriculum?
So my undergraduate curriculum, I have a first year course called Modern Women, Modern Artists, which is one of my favourite courses at undergraduate because it's all new first years and we go out and about in London and it's pretty much all off-site and we go to exhibitions or permanent collections where we have a focus on women artists in particular. So that's a very fun course. It's a really great way of introducing new students to the Courtauld who may not be familiar with London galleries, to the kind of landscape of London, really, in the art world. So that's a fun course I love. A third year course I teach is called Sea of Dreams, a dialectic approach to modernism, where we look at modern contemporary art in relation to the perspective of the sea. And so we think about what it means for contemporary artists to use the sea as a kind of vehicle for the kind of work they want to make, whether that's to do with climate change, histories of the transatlantic slave economy, the Pacific Ocean, whatever that might be. We think about artists for whom the sea is, or body, not just the sea, but also bodies of water actually, are central to how they think and how they make work. And then at MA level, I teach a course called MA Black Futures, Reimagining Modernism After Critical Race, where I like to think about time in that, and I like to think about what the future looked like, say, to Edmonia Lewis in the late 19th century. How did she think about the future, or how it looked to Lois Malley-Jones, or really how the future looked in the past and how we think about it now. So it's really about this kind of melding and interaction between past and future in relation to the present.
I feel like I would have enjoyed doing all of those different courses, but also especially for first-year students. I think that for me personally, I did my undergraduate at UCL in art history, and there was one course, it was Rosemarie San Juan, who used to also be a lecturer at the Courtauld, I think, and then went to UCL. And I remember we went to the National Gallery for that. So every, I think, Monday or Tuesday or whenever it was, we went to the National Gallery and had our classes there. But there were no other courses, really, that took us out and about and around. And I would have so needed that in my first year, having, freshly moved to London, not knowing the amazing plethora of organizations, both institutional as well as commercial, that offer really high quality shows in London, because that's the best city for it.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I think to me and to my colleagues, it's a no-brainer that we take our students off-site for teaching, particularly in their first year when they first arrived in London. Because, as you say, London is such a brilliant place to be if you're studying art and art history. So why not take advantage of all its wonderful resources? And that's very much a strength of the Courtauld, actually, in their first year teaching.
Yeah. So my next question, it relates to your experience of the emerging Black art movement in Britain with artists like Lebaina Himid and Sonia Boyce in the 1980s. So how did that experience with these artists and with the emerging Black art movement influence your time as editor for art history? And I would also love to particularly focus on the June 2021 publication on Black British modernism.
Yeah. Interestingly, I have always run two areas of research alongside one another. One is German modernism and the other is Black British art. And really, those two strands of research have been very much determined by the time or the place or the institution that I happen to find myself in. So having done my PhD on German modernism, I went to go and work at the University of East Anglia for a few years. Norwich and I didn't really suit each other, so I flew back to London as soon as I could, and I worked at the V&A for a bit, but then that didn't really suit me either, and I realised what I missed was actually doing library-based research. So then I got a job at an institution in London that didn't have any money for research. And so I had to pivot really. And I thought, well, I don't want to stop doing my research. So if I can't go to Germany, I will use the abundant resources that are available to me in London. And I knew that there was a big sort of set of archives at the University of East London called the African and Asian Artists Archives, and that was virtually untapped art historically. And so I took myself along there and I thought, well, I'll go and have a look what's in these archives. And it was being run by Sonia Boyce and David A. Bailey at the time. They were its caretakers at UEL. So that's when I first met them. Prior to that, I had met Lubena Himid when I got my very first job, actually. She'd come up to UEA to meet with Jane Beckett, who'd written about her work. And Jane introduced me to Lubena, and so I knew her then from the early 90s. And then again, Sonia and David from the early 2000s. And Sonia actually commissioned me after I'd been to UEL. She got in touch and she commissioned me to write a piece for a project she was working on, which I did. And then I turned that into my very first article for art history, actually, which is called Cultural Crossings, Performing Race and Transgender in the Work of Moti Roti. And so I turned that into a longer article for art history in 2003. And so I continued to work on Black British art, and when I was asked to contribute to an anthology of essays on British art, I decided to write about Lubena Himid's Revenge series of paintings. And so I was commissioned to do that in 2008. And so it didn't get published because it took a long time to get the edited volume together. And it was published in 2013. And so I always had essays on Black British art alongside the two monographs I'd written on German modernism. And really, the monographs were my sort of formal academic institutional hat, really, because to get a job in academia in the UK, it needed to be something that people would recognise for me to be able to teach, which is not, quite interesting in terms of the kind of racial histories of art history in this country. So I wanted to do the Black British art, and I wasn't going to give that up, and it continued as a sideline. But to get the jobs, I needed to publish on something that could be understood and taught and allegedly recruit students, which was modernism. So the two things were kept separate for a long time, side by side. And it's quite funny. Occasionally I would be asked to give a research talk on British art. So I would give a talk on Lubena Himid and her work. And often, you could kind of feel the tumbleweed afterwards because it just failed to signify within kind of white-centric art history for a long time. Really. And so the issue of art history, well, as soon as I became editor of art history in 2017, I was appointed. 2018 was my first editorial. My first editorial was Whose Art History? Question mark. And it was illustrated by Marlene Smith's Art History, which is an installation piece simply called Art History, which is some artificial flowers in a vase covered by kind of sugar water coated crochet with a series of different photographs of Black women practitioners on the wall behind. It was made in 1987 and was bought by Sheffield Museums and has been there ever since, but nobody really knew about it. And it absolutely gets to the heart of this issue of whose art history, whose art history are we attending to and not attending to? Because when I wrote this editorial in 2018, that work had been in Sheffield museums since the late 80s. So it had been there for almost sort of just over 30 years, and yet hardly anyone knew about it. So that's really the agenda I brought to art history. And so one of the early things I wanted to do was I talked to Sonia after her final conference at Tate Britain to wrap up a large project that she had run called Black Artists and Modernisms. And I said, where are you thinking of publishing your outputs? Would you be interested in publishing one of the outputs in art history? And she said, absolutely. And so that's how we got to do that, because she understood that as a journal in the field, it has an influence as a kind of the leading academic journal in its field, actually. So it was an important place for kind of the seriousness of what the project that we were trying to do was and would be taken. And had the potential. Art history has the potential of changing the field. And one of the other things I did in art history was with Catherine Grant. We published this Decolonising Art History questionnaire, which we put together in 2019, and came out just before COVID lockdowns, actually. Came out in February 2020 as well, which again has been the biggest downloaded article in the journal's history, really.
Has it?
So it's over 100,000 downloads.
Oh my God.
Which is a lot for an academic art history journal article.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Wow. Well, that ties really well into my next question, which is also my penultimate question, because as a specialist in German Expressionism, Weimar culture, and Black British art, you've authored numerous books and articles in both areas, as you've just stated, and you've curated exhibitions that focus on those themes. So what you mentioned earlier, making modernism at the RA, and then Entangled Pasts. Those are kind of right up those different alleys in terms of research. So can you tell me just a little bit more? I know you've just delved into it, but a bit more about your specializations. And when do you think in practice that your approaches to each, do you hold them quite separately from one another, even when you're curating or when you're writing? Or do you feel like they intersect in some ways or are related?
That's a great question. I think I used to hold them separately for pragmatic reasons, as I've kind of touched on, what was accepted in the academy and what wasn't.
Yeah.
But now and also since the editorship of Art History, actually, I've found increasingly a way to bring them together. So I published a special issue called Weimar's Others in Art History when I was editor. And the introduction to that really kind of turns accepted notions of what German art history and German modernism can be. And so the premise I started with was the exhibition that Neil McGregor put on at the British Museum called Memories of a Nation, which is all about German history. And basically what I sort of did with that was outlined what that book and exhibition were doing. Then I turned it on its head and asked questions about, well, what if we actually looked differently at German culture? Because what Neil McGregor was presenting was a white German version of German history, and actually took no account of the decades long worth of publications on Black Germany. And so I questioned that, and I raised questions about that, and it's led to a project I want to pursue but I haven't had time to yet, which is based around the issue of the circus, because obviously after the First World War, Germany lost the war, as we know, lost its colonies, and it had a colony in Namibia, and the massacre of the Herero people was only recently really confronted by the nation, and they apologised to the Herero, and it was an enormous massacre of the Herero, and what happened was that the people that they had brought over from Namibia, the German administration, colonial administration, had brought over from Namibia to perform in human zoos and the like, after the First World War, were stuck in Germany, stateless and paperless, because they were no longer German citizens, because Germany had lost its colonies, and they could no longer go back to Namibia because they had no passports to go back into the city. So these people were left in Germany. And there has been research on them more recently, but there's not really been any art historical thinking about them. So, if you look at someone like August Sander and his People of the 20th Century, there are figures of colour littered throughout that enormous seven-volume photographic...
As we're looking down at the 7 volumes, yep.
photographic history.
In Dot's office.
Yeah, so this enormous 7-volume photographic documentation of what Sander calls people of the 20th century, there are people of colour, and they're at the periphery, and they're often in the circus. And there's a very beautiful images, and there are also ones that an artist like Maud Salter drew on for her series of works called Circus as well. So this is where there are intersections, and so I want to pick that up really, and think more deeply about what happened to this community. There were about 200 people of colour living in Hamburg during the 1920s, for example.
Yeah.
And there will be in other cities too.
Yeah.
And there was an association for German artists of colour, German people of colour, and they had a spokesman called Lois Brody, who was a Hollywood film actor eventually, and he was a film actor in the Weimar era. He was well known, actually. He always played exotic types. He was typecast in films, but as a high-profile person of colour in the 20s in Germany, he often advocated for other people of colour. So there's really interesting stories to still be told about these communities in Germany that I would like to tell.
I think because I'm Austrian American and, studying here in London and everything. And I think that type of research and that direction of combining these two is so incredibly interesting and important. And what you've just told me about the notion of the circus and how that type of framework for your research is going to be, I think that's so intriguing. Is that something that you think you're going to be researching soon? Because I was also going to ask you, how do you find time for all of this? Because you do so much.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'd love to be able to have the time to do the circus book soon, but I'm pretty sure I won't have the time to do the circus book soon. I think I need to probably apply for a grant to get the time to do it, because it will require quite a lot of in-depth archival work.
Yeah.
I've identified a few archives in Berlin and Cologne that I want to visit, and also in Hamburg, actually. So it would be quite a big project, but I think it's such an important one. I'd like to do it. So in the short term, what I actually want to do is I'm writing a book called The Courage to Look, and it is based on a sort of spin-off of all the research that went into Entangled Pasts. So Entangled Pasts was a sort of 3.5-year process, really, and the exhibition is the end point, the cherry on the top. But actually, before I forget, I want to actually write down what I know and what I learnt doing that process, what I learnt about the artwork, what I learnt about the history, what I learnt about the process of the curating. I just want to write all of that down into a book while I can still remember, because I think it's kind of going to be quite an interesting legacy thing to have for the exhibition too.
Yeah.
I'm writing it. I have an agent, a literary agent, and she's been pressing me for quite a while to write something. And I think this is that book.
Yeah.
But I also have another book which is more academic, which is drawing together all the essays I've written recently. I've written a lot of essays in the last few years on artists like Frank Bowling and Claudette Johnson and Lubena Himid, Veronica Ryan. And I just want to draw them all together and actually flesh them all out and give them a framework. And that book's called For Opacity, which is based on Edouard Glissant's argument about not everything has to be transparent and visible, that things are complex, and that actually opacity is quite an important quality to have, because it means that if you're opaque and you're not visible, you can't be categorized and you have more freedom.
That's really interesting. Is there a publishing date that our listeners can look forward to, or is that something that's still on the horizon and we can just say it's on the horizon?
It's all still on the horizon. I don't have a publishing date yet. I'm just, at the moment, now that Entangles Pasts is finished, just gathering my thoughts together and formulating my proposal, and so that I can make my agent a happy woman.
Well, that's really wonderful, Dot. I have one final question for you, and it's just a fun one that I always end the episode on. And it is, if you could pick one artist from art history to have dinner with, who would it be and why?
Yeah, I can't choose one. I've got different ones for different reasons. So one of them I'd love to have, I'm not sure dinner would be very fun though, but it would be interesting, would be Courtauld. I have so many questions I want to ask her. And also another one would be Paula Modernism Becker, because I've got questions for her as well. In fact, all the women who are in Making Modernism, I'd like to have a dinner party with all of them.
A Making Modernism dinner party.
Yeah. So that's Marianne Farefkin and Gabriella Munter too, because I have so many unanswered questions that I would want to put to all of them about various aspects of their lives and careers. But another one I'd really want, and I really wish I'd known her before she passed away, was Emma Amos. I'd really like to have dinner with her.
All right. Dot, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your time with me on this dreary Monday afternoon.
Thank you.
And that is it for today on All About Art. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave me a rating or a review, as it helps more people discover the show. Also, feel free to share with your friends, or if you share on social media, tag me and get in touch. Thank you so much for listening.